What is up, y'all? It's your boy Aniki coming at you with another video. My Hero Academia Chapter 338 review. The story of how we all became heroes, part 1. You already know we go through the pages. Let's begin. If you haven't read, you gotta go. Sorry, that's just how it is. Now, this chapter picks up right where we left off, with Midoriya having been reaching out to Aoyama, and now this chapter immediately debunks the notion of like, oh, this is gonna just get to be a super sweet thing, because Tsukauchi comes in and goes, not so fast, Midoriya. Sansa, go ahead and gag young Aoyama. And no, there will be no hand holding. He's in police custody. This strangely very cold demeanor, and I understand that Aoyama is like a criminal at this point, but it is very weird how cold he is being towards the children. And he starts talking about like, oh, well, regardless of any extenuating circumstances, he still conspired with All For One, basically treating Aoyama like a true villain. Like Aoyama has called himself a villain, and now we have Tsukauchi more or less treating him like he's no different than the average run-of-the-mill scum. And this is part of the problem with hero society. This is one of the things that My Hero has been emphasizing throughout the story, which is the mistreatment of especially children and those who have been manipulated by better or higher tier villains into committing bad acts, and just completely consigning them to being scum and not worth reaching out to. Now, one of the things that I find to be a bit of a red flag on this play also, though, is that Tsukauchi says, furthermore, we can't be sure he's not booby-trapped like Nagant. And he's like, oh, well, you know, it seems like he said, but the thing that bothers me about this is that Tsukauchi was the same dude that said, you know, oh, he's probably not going to blow up because he got his quirk like 10 years ago. And he hasn't already blown up for betraying All For One. And this chapter, like it's like he saw that they accepted Aoyama and they wanted to work with him. And it's like he decided, oh, no, this is bad. So they're like, we can't let Aoyama talk anymore. And then we get this very strange shot of Tsukauchi looking extra sad while next to Deku and disappointed. And it reminds me very much of the Aoyama shots during those Aoyama chapters where he was, you know, like doing all the weird stuff and drawing Deku's attention and, quote, trying to be his friend. So it kind of comes off the wrong way. And then Tsukauchi asked them like why they didn't inform All For One about their raid in Kamino. And so, like, I've had arguments against this. I think it's a little odd that he's extremely confident that they didn't inform about Kamino, but also I think it's odd that to a certain degree that All For One really realistically had more to do on a, you know, whatever night than just sit around in a rinky-dink factory, even with the whole, oh, master, send some Nomu. In fact, if you remember, he originally calls out for Kurogiri to do it, and they just happen to be able to talk to their master through the computer, and then he reaches out. So it kind of rubs me the wrong way. But then again, All For One is also literally squatting in a cave right now, so maybe he was just chilling in that dusty, dirty building. Which I also want to point out that specific hangar seems to be a far lower quality than Ujiko's standard for what his labs look like. So it's rather fascinating to me that we have Ujiko, who had all these labs that are like this big lab with all this stuff in it, all these high ends, all these other Nomu, and then he's settling for this rinky-dink building that's just kind of like backwater. But that is where they took that Nomu based on the tracker. But that could have also been misinformation, because they could have noticed, you know, the metallic thing welded to his back and set a trap for them, specifically with All For One. So there's a couple of options that kind of go into how that could have played out that could clear him out. But I also want to emphasize something important, which is that we are on the subject of discussing people protecting their families in this context. Tsukauchi has a sister named Makoto, you are introduced to in Vigilantes, who's actually a very prominent sociologist and worked alongside Captain Celebrity over in America. And her quirk was polygraph, and it gave her the ability, obviously, to detect if someone was lying, if she was in physical contact with them. So the fact that Aoyama's parents mentioned that if they lie, they're dead, could imply that Makoto has been kidnapped, had her quirk taken, and is being used as leverage against Tsukauchi, because it's very well documented at this point, or at least by somebody like All For One, they would know that Sukauchi spends a decent amount of time with All Might. Now, obviously the idea that, they don't have any connections and consistent ability to actually reach out to All For One and he just comes to them, that's just him covering his tracks. That part, no issue with that. Just this Sukauchi behavior is a little odd. Now, one of the things that Deku does is he points out, we can't find All For One. That's the current situation. And we see Kaminari, who's, supposed to be like one of the dumbest people in the class, thinking back, do they still get to make the opening move? That's why I started just calling in, really thinking about like what Bakugo and them were saying. And then he goes, if nothing else, maybe we can steer the way the villains join the fight. The idea of controlling the way that combat is initiated. And Momo, they're all kind of turning in, and then they're like, he's the only one who could possibly deceive All For One. We talked about this last week, I believe, just the idea of potentially utilizing Aoyama as bait for All For One to hopefully get in and have an advantage to jump him and maybe take him out. Now, Aoyama is confused at the idea of them still having this faith in him because of how he has betrayed them. He's been feeling massively guilty. He's in a society that tells him directly that he's a villain, no different from any other, because he made these choices, even if they were made under duress. So, in fact, they even come in to say a crime's a crime, and I hate to say it, but you bunch are the biggest victims here, which is true. And then Ida, when he says that's all in the past and that the responsibility lies with them for being unable to perceive what's going on in his heart, they understand that if he's saying, like, if we can see that our classmate is still weeping, he's still sad, maybe we can actually do something and we can work with him, and we want to be equals, we want to be peers. And this is a callback to the provisional license dynamic where, he had that moment with Aoyama. Aoyama was talking about how he always wanted to be equal to them. And this is Ida kind of saying that, like, with the suggestion that they use Aoyama as a bait or a form of deception, this is Aoyama's chance to once again be a hero like he said he wanted to be, prove himself as their equal, atone for, helping the bad guys effectively. And then we kind of get the Bakugo panel that I know some people were offended by, which I find kind of hilarious. But he's like, I went through this crap because of you, and maybe if I just blast you 5 good times with my howitzer, we can be even. Now, Sero has like a kind of snarky, bitter attitude towards that, but it's important to note that Sero isn't the one who was kidnapped for several days, it seems like, and just stuck, chained up in villain custody with no idea where he actually was. So, and when you think about the guilt that Bakugo had to deal with because he felt like he caused the end of All Might, it makes complete sense that at least he would say something about, like, okay, but this, you did cause us legitimate harm, and that's a completely justified feeling on his part because, again, he was kidnapped. So, and then, Kirishima's coming in like, oh, you thought you were helpless, right? You couldn't, and you obeyed because you couldn't do anything in that situation. The reality is that All For One is a pretty powerful dude. And then he's, like, we went and grabbed Midori off the streets. We didn't give a crap for him being quirkless. And I do think that this is a bit of a false equivalent because at the end of the day, working for All For One and just getting a quirk from All Might are not the same thing. But ultimately, I think that they kind of understand that there's a certain, quote, shame to being quirkless. And that's why Kirishima's mind goes towards that, because even he has had quirk insecurity issues. So I think that's something that's a little off here, but it's very clear that they're just trying to find ways to make Aoyama not feel guilty. After losing Midnight, understanding that he was under the threat of murder, they have a very recent example of losing someone that they cared about to have fresh in their minds and understand that they don't want to lose that person, even if they did something they didn't approve of, especially when you look at the context of why it was done. So this kind of ties into, again, like, it's kind of a direct result of what they experienced in the war, and that just kind of is what it is. Now, and then when we get to the part where Suguji's like, yeah, let's not be all excited. Even if they're cooperating with us, even if they're helping with the search, they already told us All For One won't believe any lies. So he seems assured that All For One won't be able to be lied to, which kind of leans into that whole perhaps Makoto was kidnapped and had her quirk stolen. Aspect that we could be having set up here, especially since All For One was hanging out in Naruhita and doing stuff during the backstory of Vigilantes where we met Makoto, so we know that All For One was a present threat back then doing things, and he likely could have exploited the situation and taken her in at some point, which would allow, especially when you look at where we are right now in Vigilantes, which is about 1 to 2 years before the story started to canon My Hero, it would allow for him to have made some moves a year before All Might wound up in UA. So that's just something to think about. So we finally get Aizawa's take on this, as he's been watching from an iPad this entire time, or the equivalent, and he quickly addresses the weakness of his students and asks him, did you actually have a plan? And when Deku admits that he didn't, Eraser's like, look, Detective Tsukauchi, I'm partially responsible for not understanding that Aoyama was a traitor, but even more so, I share this responsibility, and I feel the same way as the kids. I do not have this desire to see Aoyama punished for being blackmailed. So him telling Aoyama, I have zero intention to expel you, is important. And it seems like a goofy line, but it's worth noting that the story literally started off with Eraserhead threatening to expel the kid who got the worst scores. And the two lowest scores in that fitness exam were Aoyama and Deku. So it's not like Aoyama hasn't had to deal with the fear of expulsion before either. So this setup allows for him to step in and say, this thing that I instilled in you, this fear that I put into you from the beginning, when I said I was evaluating your quality and potential as a hero, I'm telling you now, Aoyama, you are still good enough to be a hero. You do still have the potential. We can make this work. So one of the things that's worth noting is that I did see a popular theory or a semi-popular theory that perhaps, because we cut away to Eraserhead explaining some kind of plan, but the Aoyama family is specifically deafened for it. Somebody pointed out that a lot of the kids that are depicted while we're getting this off-screen rant from Eraserhead are people who interacted with Shinso. So the plan could be to finally utilize that plot device that people have always wondered about, like, hey, Shinso, because people have always said Shinso could beat All For One. That's been a joke for a long time. Like, all he had to do was say the right thing, and because All For One is so egotistical and can't shut up, he would definitely respond, which would lead to him getting brainwashed. So that could be what they're looking for with this approach. I do think that'd be really risky, so that does come into question with Eraserhead's character, because, Shinso has had even less experience than everybody else as far as being a hero. He hasn't been around to train Shinso for the past month because he's still in the hospital. So there's some flaws to that logic, but I'm not completely opposed to it, as All For One doesn't know about Shinso. Aoyama doesn't know Shinso that well, and it would allow for him to come into play. Granted, if, for example, All For One had ever asked Aoyama about his classmates or different interactions he's had, or anything like that, or if you remember, All For One was watching the sports festival, he may have taken note of Shinso's quirk, and he could be on guard. Considering how, again, vain and egotistical he is, that doesn't seem likely, but we have two candidates that I consider to still potentially be traitors in this room, with Nezu and now Tsukauchi on the table, as far as I'm concerned, that would leak that information, because they will have heard this plan, which would allow All For One to, in fact, respond and know what to do ahead of time. So, and then they're told, keep everything in confidence. What's interesting about that, though, is that if the students are keeping things in confidence, and then Tsukauchi taking people to HQ is going to be hard to explain, because that, unless they somehow are going to manage to, sneak out underground or do something that stops the civilians who already had unrest issues from seeing them actually leave. So we cut back to the dorm rooms. Bakugo taking out the trash, them just doing some general cleaning, preparing. There's this random shot of the 2 glasses of water, 2 cups not overflowing. It could be a reference to, Deku and Aoyama getting quirks placed within them. And, like how the analogy was with the cup with Toshinori. Not 100% sure on that one. But we see them talk about how they must do something about their costume between Ida and Deku due to the damage from recent adventures. And everybody's like, yeah, Invisible Girl's like, we'll be able to get this done. It'll work. And all of Class A is having their determination highlighted in this big spread where they're really focused on taking out All for One. That is their goal. And we get this cut to Deku walking down the hallway, heading towards the development studios, and he's looking all serious, and the door explodes. Mei Hatsume is talking about how it hurts, and then boom. Where we see that Mei is once again landing on top of a Deku, and his face is 100% serious this time. None of that nervous, oh, girls' boobs are on my face stuff. Just him being serious, focused, trying to get his costume upgraded, trying to get the pieces back. And for all we know, Mei Hatsume might even be sitting there, having already been working on upgrades for Deku's costumes, because she's an ever insistent tinkerer. And so I would not be surprised if that were the case, that she had already been working on, whether it's different Air Force gloves or different types of reinforcement technology for his arm. With the mid gauntlets having been a thing, she could have taken that technology and studied it a bit over the past couple of days and made some modifications to incorporate it into his gloves. There's a bit of wiggle room that we can kind of work with here, because for all we know, Hatsume could have been talking to Melissa Shield, and like they could have met at some point, and we could get some backstory on that. A lot of openings here. Last chapter of the year, definitely enjoyed it, but this is 100% set up for what is to come, with the news that at Jump Festa that Horikoshi is saying that he intends to try to end the series within a year. Every chapter could be, the story of how we all became heroes, part blank, similar to how the Culling Games are, the Culling Games Tokyo Colony #1, part blah blah blah, or how it was like the Shibuya incident, part 34, just stuff like that. So we could be getting a numbering system like that going forward, where every single chapter is going to be the story of how they became heroes, part whatever. But this could also just be another 2-parter, and then we establish that, and then we keep going forward. So we have things to look out for now. And if I'm being honest with you, I don't really see it as realistic for Aoyama and his family to be able to be driven to HQ, especially depending on how far away the headquarters is. It kind of just seems like a setup for them to lose their advantage, for them to not be able to maintain the surprise jump that they were supposed to have on All for One. I could be wrong. I'm not opposed to, them actually making it, and then conversations going and exploring Central Hospital and finding out whether or not Aoyama's rigged to blow up or not. But whatever the case may be, I have a hard time believing that All for One didn't set a timetable for them to contact him. And if he did, then of course they're going to have some questions about why he hasn't said, or he's going to have questions about why they haven't said anything yet. So not as much to talk about with this chapter as we close out the year, but I'm definitely looking forward to what's to come out of this plot line. Let me know if you guys enjoyed the video down below. We had a wonderful Church of MHA stream today. Volk came back. We had Almighty Fish, brought Nader Moad on. I'm thinking about bringing on some different members as time progresses at different streams, just to make sure it's not too clunky. And we'll see how we go from there. That's all I really wanted to say about this chapter. Already uploaded a One Piece video today. Top 5 manga of 2021 should be out by the end of the week. That's all I got to say about this. Make sure you get that like, subscribe, leave a comment. Let me know what you guys are thinking about this chapter. I'm Aniki, and I am out.